It was a crisp morning in the heart of the city. The hospital buzzed with its usual rhythm, a mix of urgency, care, and quiet heroism. But beneath the sterile white walls, not all moments were equal, and not all people were treated the same. Today, in the maternity ward, a story was unfolding that would reveal much more than anyone anticipated. The pain hit her like a tidal wave. She clutched the edge of the hospital bed, trying to steady her breath. She was in labor, and it wasn't her first time, but this time felt different, more intense, more overwhelming. Her husband had stepped out to make a call, leaving her momentarily alone in the room. As she tried to focus through the contractions, the door creaked open. A nurse stepped in, clipboard in hand, her expression a mix of indifference and subtle annoyance. "You're going to have to calm down," the nurse said, her tone sharp. "You're not the only one here, you know." The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. She wasn't asking for special treatment, just understanding. She tried to explain, her voice shaky. "I'm trying. It just hurts so much." The nurse scoffed, barely glancing up from her clipboard. "Labor hurts. That's how it works. You're not the first woman to go through this, and you won't be the last." Her words were cold, dismissive, as though the woman's pain was an inconvenience rather than a reality. The woman's heart sank. She felt small, invisible, as if her suffering was nothing more than background noise in the busy hospital. She bit her lip to hold back tears, the sting of the nurse's words cutting deeper than the physical pain. Minutes felt like hours, and the nurse's attitude didn't improve. Every time she came into the room, her remarks grew sharper. She rolled her eyes when the woman groaned in pain. She muttered under her breath, loud enough to be heard, but not clear enough to confront. Some people just love the drama. The woman's husband returned to find his wife trembling, tears streaming down her face. Alarmed, he rushed to her side. "What happened? Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. She hesitated, not wanting to cause trouble, but the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. Before she could respond, the nurse re-entered the room, her demeanor as icy as before. "Oh good, you're back. Maybe now she'll settle down," she said with a smirk, her tone dripping with condescension. The husband froze, his jaw tightening. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "What did you just say?" The nurse's expression faltered for a moment before she shrugged. "I'm just saying, she's being a bit overdramatic. Labor is painful, but it's not the end of the world." He stared at her, his eyes narrowing. There was a quiet power in his presence, something unspoken yet undeniable. The nurse's confidence began to waver, but she held her ground, unaware of who she was talking to. "You don't think her pain is serious?" he asked, his tone dangerously calm. The nurse crossed her arms. "I think she's making a bigger deal out of it than necessary. Some women just have lower pain tolerance, that's all." The woman's husband nodded slowly, as if considering her words. Then, without another word, he pulled out his phone and made a call. His tone was polite but authoritative. "Yes, I need you to come to room 304 immediately. There's a situation that requires attention." The nurse frowned, confused. "Who are you calling?" she asked, a hint of nervousness creeping into her voice. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to his wife, his expression softening. "I'm sorry you've had to deal with this," he said gently, taking her hand in his. "It won't happen again." Within minutes, there was a knock at the door. A senior doctor and a hospital administrator entered, their faces a mix of respect and concern. The nurse's eyes widened as she realized who they were. She looked back at the husband, a sinking feeling settling in her stomach. "Sir, how can we assist you?" the administrator asked, addressing the husband with deference. The nurse's face turned pale. She glanced between the husband and the officials, trying to piece together what was happening. "Wait, who is he?" she asked, her voice shaky. The administrator's gaze hardened as he turned to her. "He's the owner of this hospital," he said matter-of-factly. The room fell silent. The nurse's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The weight of her actions hit her like a freight train. She had dismissed, belittled, and mocked the wife of the very man who controlled the institution she worked for. And now she would have to face the consequences. But what would those consequences be? And how would the husband ensure that no other patient endured what his wife had just experienced? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the hushed whispers between the senior doctor and the administrator. The nurse stood frozen in place, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, each second stretching longer than the last. Her earlier confidence had completely evaporated, leaving only a sickening mix of panic and regret. The husband didn't raise his voice or act out in anger. Instead, he simply held his wife's hand, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the tension in the room. He turned to the administrator, his tone measured but firm. "I want to know how something like this can happen in a hospital that prides itself on compassion and excellence. My wife came here for care, not to be ridiculed." The administrator nodded, his expression grave. "You're absolutely right, sir. This is unacceptable, and I assure you we will address it immediately." The nurse opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself or perhaps apologize, but no words came. She had been so focused on her own frustrations that she hadn't stopped to consider the impact of her actions. Now, standing in the presence of the hospital's owner, she realized too late how badly she had miscalculated. Meanwhile, the woman in the bed remained quiet, her breathing still labored but more steady now with her husband by her side. She didn't want to relive the humiliation she had felt or draw more attention to herself, but the hurt lingered. It wasn't just the pain of labor that had brought her to tears. It was the way she had been treated, as though her feelings didn't matter, as though she didn't matter. The senior doctor stepped forward, clearing his throat. "If I may, sir, we'll begin an internal review immediately. We'll also ensure that your wife receives the highest level of care moving forward." The husband nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. "Good, but this isn't just about my wife. What about the other patients who don't have someone to advocate for them? How many others have been treated like this without anyone noticing?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. The administrator's face tightened, and he turned to the nurse. "You will step outside with me now," he said curtly. The nurse hesitated but ultimately followed, her footsteps echoing in the hallway as the door closed behind her. The tension in the room didn't lift, but at least the oppressive presence of her disdain was gone. The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly, though her grip on her husband's hand remained firm. For a moment, there was silence. The husband stroked her hand gently, his expression softening. "You're so strong," he whispered. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." She shook her head, managing a small smile despite everything. "It's not your fault. You're here now, and that's what matters." As the hours passed, the mood in the room gradually shifted. The senior doctor stayed close, ensuring that the woman was comfortable and monitoring her progress. Other nurses came and went, each of them kinder and more attentive than the one before. Word seemed to have spread about who the couple was, and the staff's renewed professionalism was impossible to ignore. Still, the experience had left its mark. The woman couldn't help but replay the nurse's words in her mind, the way she had dismissed her pain and made her feel small. It wasn't just about the physical discomfort. It was about the lack of dignity, the sense that she didn't deserve to be treated with respect. Her husband, however, was not one to let things go so easily. While his primary concern was his wife's well-being, he couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened if he hadn't been there. He knew that real change would require more than just a stern conversation or a promise to do better. It would require accountability and action. Later that evening, after his wife had finally drifted off to sleep, he made another call. This time, it wasn't to the hospital staff, but to a trusted colleague who specialized in organizational reform. "I need you to come by tomorrow," he said quietly, stepping into the hallway to avoid disturbing his wife. "There are some systemic issues here that need to be addressed." The next morning, the hospital was abuzz with activity. The events of the previous day had sparked a flurry of meetings and discussions among the leadership team. The administrator had already begun drafting a new training program for staff, emphasizing empathy and cultural sensitivity. The senior doctor had volunteered to oversee the initiative, determined to set a better example for his colleagues. As for the nurse, she had been placed on leave pending a formal investigation. Sitting alone in her apartment, she couldn't shake the memory of the woman's tear-streaked face or the quiet disappointment in her husband's eyes. She knew she had made a mistake, but the full weight of her actions was only beginning to sink in. Meanwhile, the woman and her husband prepared to welcome their child into the world. Despite the rocky start, they were determined to focus on the joy of the moment. The contractions were coming faster now, and the medical team was fully engaged, offering words of encouragement and support. The husband stayed by her side through it all, holding her hand and reminding her how proud he was of her strength. And when their baby finally arrived, crying and full of life, the room seemed to glow with a sense of hope and renewal. But even as they celebrated this new beginning, the husband knew their work wasn't done. The hospital's culture needed to change, and he was in a position to make that happen. This wasn't just about fixing what had gone wrong for his wife. It was about ensuring that every patient received the care and respect they deserved. As he held his newborn child, he made a silent promise to do whatever it took to create a better future. Not just for his family, but for everyone who walked through those hospital doors. And while the road ahead would be long and challenging, he knew it was a fight worth taking on. The following days were a blur of activity and emotion. The hospital's leadership team moved quickly, determined to address the fallout from the incident. Meetings were held behind closed doors, policies were scrutinized, and whispers about impending changes rippled through the staff. But for the woman and her husband, the experience lingered like a shadow, a reminder that even in moments of vulnerability, dignity and respect could be denied. The woman's recovery was slow but steady, her body adjusting to the physical toll of labor, while her heart processed the emotional weight of what had happened. Her husband rarely left her side, his presence a constant source of comfort and strength. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, a fire burned. He had spent years building a hospital that was supposed to stand as a beacon of compassion and care. To see it tarnished by negligence and indifference was a wound he couldn't ignore. One evening, as the city's lights twinkled outside the hospital room window, the woman turned to her husband. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, her voice still weak but steady, "for standing up for me, for making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You shouldn't have had to go through that," he replied, his voice low but firm. "And I'm going to make sure no one else does." The next day, the husband met with the hospital's board of directors. They gathered in the executive conference room, a sleek space filled with imposing leather chairs and walls lined with awards and accolades. The tension in the room was palpable as the husband took his seat at the head of the table. He didn't raise his voice or slam his fist on the table. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention. "We have a problem," he began, his tone measured but resolute. "And it's not just about one nurse or one incident. It's about the culture we've allowed to fester here. A culture where patients can be dismissed, belittled, and treated as less than human. That ends today." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but no one interrupted. The husband outlined his vision for change, starting with mandatory empathy training for all staff and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination or unprofessional behavior. He proposed creating a patient advocacy committee, ensuring that every voice would be heard and every concern addressed. And he made it clear that this wasn't just about damage control. It was about restoring the hospital's integrity and mission. Meanwhile, the nurse who had sparked the firestorm was struggling to come to terms with her actions. She had been suspended pending the investigation, and the weight of her choices hung heavy on her shoulders. Alone in her small apartment, she replayed the events over and over in her mind, each memory sharper and more painful than the last. She thought about the woman's face, the pain and humiliation she had seen in her eyes, and the quiet strength of her husband as he defended her. The nurse wanted to believe that she wasn't a bad person, that she hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But intent didn't erase impact, and the reality of what she had done was inescapable. She knew she had to face the consequences of her actions, but more than that, she wanted to make things right. The question was, how? Back at the hospital, the changes were already beginning to take shape. The senior doctor who had stepped in during the initial incident had taken on a leadership role in the reform efforts. Staff meetings were held to address the new policies, and while some employees welcomed the changes, others resisted, grumbling about unnecessary bureaucracy and political correctness. The tension among the staff was palpable, but the husband remained steadfast in his commitment to see the reforms through. As the days turned into weeks, the woman's strength returned, and she was finally ready to leave the hospital. The morning of her discharge was bittersweet. She was eager to return home and start this new chapter with her husband and their baby, but a part of her still felt the sting of what had happened. As she was wheeled through the corridors, she couldn't help but notice the way the staff's demeanor had shifted. There was a newfound attentiveness, a sense of urgency to ensure every patient felt seen and valued. But not everything had changed. As they passed by the nurse's station, she overheard a whispered remark that made her heart sink. "All this fuss over one patient," someone muttered, just loud enough to be heard. The woman's husband stopped in his tracks, his expression hardening. He didn't say anything, but the intensity in his eyes spoke volumes. The staff member who had made the comment quickly looked away, their face flushing with embarrassment. The ride home was quiet, the weight of the past weeks settling over them like a heavy blanket. Once they arrived, the woman let out a deep breath, relieved to finally be in the comfort of her own space. She held her baby close, finding solace in the tiny, warm bundle in her arms. Her husband, however, couldn't shake the lingering frustration. He knew that change wouldn't come overnight, and he was prepared for the fight ahead. But moments like the one at the nurse's station reminded him of just how deeply rooted the problem was. Late that night, as the city slept, the husband sat at his desk, poring over documents and drafting plans for the next phase of the hospital's transformation. He was determined to root out the toxic attitudes that had allowed this incident to happen. But the more he delved into the work, the more he realized how vast and complex the problem was. It wasn't just about policies or training. It was about changing hearts and minds, about fostering a culture of empathy and respect. As the clock ticked past midnight, the woman joined him, her steps soft and deliberate so as not to wake the baby. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You can't do this all on your own," she said gently. "Let people help you. Let me help you." He looked up at her, his eyes weary but determined. "I just want to make things better," he said quietly. "For you, for our child, for everyone who comes through those doors." "And you will," she replied, her voice steady. "But you don't have to carry this burden alone." Her words stayed with him long after she had gone back to bed. He knew she was right, but letting go of control wasn't easy for him. Still, he resolved to lean on the people around him, to trust in their shared commitment to the hospital's mission. The next morning brought a new sense of purpose. The husband convened a meeting with the leadership team, outlining a plan to involve not just the staff, but also the patients and the community in the reform efforts. He proposed town hall meetings, open forums where people could share their experiences and provide feedback. He knew that real change would require listening to the voices of those who had been marginalized and overlooked. As the plans began to take shape, the tension in the hospital reached a boiling point. Some staff members resisted the changes, arguing that the new policies were unnecessary or overly restrictive. Others embraced the reforms, seeing them as an opportunity to create a more inclusive and compassionate environment. The divide among the staff grew more pronounced, and the atmosphere was charged with a sense of impending confrontation. The woman's husband knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was prepared to face the challenges head-on. He had seen firsthand the harm that could be done when empathy and respect were lacking, and he was determined to ensure that no one else would have to endure what his wife had gone through. As the days turned into weeks, the hospital became a battleground for change, with every step forward met with resistance, but also progress. And as the husband stood on the precipice of the biggest challenge of his career, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The journey was far from over, but he knew that they were moving in the right direction. And as the tension reached its peak, he braced himself for the battles to come, knowing that the stakes had never been higher. As the days stretched on, the hospital became a whirlwind of change and resistance. The meetings with staff and community members began to unveil more stories, some heartwarming, others chilling, but all of them painting a vivid picture of what had been allowed to thrive behind closed doors. The husband remained steadfast, his presence commanding, his dedication unwavering. Yet beneath the surface, there was a growing unease he couldn't quite put into words. Something felt off, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, and it lingered in the back of his mind. One afternoon, during yet another meeting with the board, a middle-aged nurse approached him in the corridor. Her demeanor was hesitant, her voice low as though she feared being overheard. "Sir," she began, clutching a folder tightly to her chest, "I think there's something you need to see." He paused, studying her carefully. She looked nervous, her eyes darting down the hallway, but there was a sincerity in her expression that caught his attention. "What is it?" he asked. I've been here for a long time," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I've seen things that don't sit right. I didn't think it was my place to say anything before, but after what happened to your wife." She trailed off, swallowing hard before holding out the folder. "These are records, complaints, reports that were buried, incidents that should have been investigated but weren't." His heart sank as he took the folder, his fingers brushing against the frayed edges of the documents inside. He could tell by the weight of it that this wasn't just a minor oversight or an isolated issue. This was systemic. "Why are you giving this to me now?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of tension. The nurse glanced over her shoulder before replying. "Because I think someone's trying to cover it up. And if they know I've spoken to you." She didn't finish the sentence, but the fear in her eyes said enough. She turned and hurried away, leaving him standing alone in the corridor, with the weight of her words pressing down on him. Back in his office, he opened the folder, his breath catching as he scanned the pages. The reports detailed a pattern of neglect and misconduct, stretching back years. Complaints about dismissive attitudes, unprofessional behavior, and even outright discrimination had been quietly filed away, ignored, or marked as resolved without any action taken. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the extent of the problem. This wasn't just about one nurse or even a handful of staff members. This was a culture that had been allowed to rot from the inside out. As he continued reading, a name caught his eye. It appeared multiple times across different reports, each one painting a picture of someone who seemed to thrive on their position of power. The administrator, the same man who had assured him that the situation with his wife would be handled swiftly and appropriately. The husband's jaw tightened as he realized that the person he had trusted to help lead the charge for change might be part of the problem. That evening, he shared the folder's contents with his wife. She listened intently, her expression shifting between anger and sadness as he read aloud some of the more egregious incidents. When he finished, she placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him as always. "You need to confront him," she said firmly. "If he's been complicit in this, he can't be allowed to stay." He nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. But before he could act, another curveball was thrown his way. The next morning, as he prepared to confront the administrator, he received an urgent call from the head of the hospital's IT department. "Sir, there's something you need to see," the voice on the other end said, laced with tension. "We've discovered irregularities in the security system's access logs. It looks like someone's been tampering with patient files." His heart sank further as he followed the IT lead to a secure office. There on the screen were logs showing unauthorized access to sensitive patient records, including his wife's. The implications were staggering. Someone had been actively trying to manipulate or erase data, likely to cover their tracks. The husband clenched his fists, the weight of the betrayal hitting him hard. "Who's responsible for this?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. "We're still investigating," the IT lead replied. "But the access credentials used, they belong to the administrator." The husband felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay composed. He needed to handle this carefully. If the administrator was behind this, he couldn't risk tipping him off too soon. Instead, he called an emergency meeting with the board, presenting the evidence he had gathered and outlining the next steps. The tension in the room was palpable as he laid everything out. The buried reports, the tampered files, the administrator's apparent involvement. The board members listened in stunned silence, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. When he finished, one of them finally spoke. "If this is true, we need to act immediately," she said, her voice firm. "But we need to be sure. We can't afford to make accusations without concrete proof." The husband agreed, though the idea of waiting any longer made his stomach churn. They decided to bring in an independent investigator to review the evidence and conduct interviews with staff. It was a calculated risk, but he knew it was the right move. Transparency and accountability were essential if they were going to rebuild trust. As the investigation got underway, the atmosphere at the hospital grew even more tense. Whispers of the administrator's potential involvement spread like wildfire, and the staff became increasingly divided. Some rallied behind the husband, grateful for his efforts to bring about change. Others remained loyal to the administrator, either out of fear or a belief that he was being unfairly targeted. The husband tried to stay focused, but the stress was beginning to take its toll. Late one night, as he sat alone in his office, he received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "You're digging too deep." His breath caught as he opened it, his eyes scanning the brief but chilling message inside. "Walk away while you still can," it read. "Some things are better left buried." For a moment, he felt a flicker of fear, but it was quickly replaced by determination. Whoever had sent the message clearly didn't understand who they were dealing with. He wasn't about to back down now, not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. He forwarded the email to the investigator and doubled down on his efforts, reaching out to other hospitals and organizations for guidance on best practices for addressing systemic issues. The investigation's findings began to trickle in, each revelation more damning than the last. The administrator's fingerprints were all over the buried reports and tampered files. But there was also evidence implicating others, including a small group of senior staff who had helped him maintain the status quo. The scope of the problem was staggering, but it also gave the husband hope. The more they uncovered, the closer they came to dismantling the toxic culture that had taken root. Then, just as it seemed like the tide was turning, another twist emerged. One of the junior nurses came forward with a startling revelation. The administrator hadn't been acting alone. There was someone else pulling the strings, someone with even more influence and power. The husband's blood ran cold as the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just about one bad actor or a few complicit staff members. This was a battle against a deeply entrenched system that would stop at nothing to protect itself. The stakes had never been higher, and the husband knew the road ahead would be more treacherous than ever. But he also knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stop until every last thread of corruption had been unraveled. The pressure had reached its peak as the investigation neared its conclusion. The evidence against the administrator and his inner circle was overwhelming. Yet the husband knew the final step would be the hardest, confronting the deeply entrenched system that allowed such corruption to persist. The board had called an emergency meeting to discuss the findings, and the atmosphere was tense as the husband presented the final report, outlining every instance of misconduct, negligence, and cover-up. The administrator was present, sitting stiffly at the head of the table, his expression carefully blank. But as the husband detailed the tampered files, buried complaints, and corroborating witness testimonies, cracks began to show. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, and his fingers tapped nervously on the table. Still, he maintained his denial, claiming the evidence was circumstantial and accusing the husband of orchestrating a witch hunt. But then the investigator revealed the most damning piece of evidence: a series of emails directly linking the administrator to the efforts to silence whistleblowers and erase incriminating records. The room fell silent as the emails were displayed on the projector screen, the words stark and undeniable. The administrator's face turned ashen as the board members exchanged shocked glances. One by one, they began to voice their condemnation, their confidence in his leadership shattered. As security escorted the administrator out of the building, the husband felt a fleeting sense of relief, but he knew this was only the beginning. The systemic issues ran far deeper than one man, and the real work of rebuilding the hospital's culture lay ahead. He stood before the staff and board members, addressing them with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "This isn't just about holding one person accountable," he said. "It's about creating a place where everyone feels safe, valued, and respected. A place where mistakes are learned from, not hidden. We owe it to our patients and to each other to do better." The staff responded with a mixture of applause and somber nods, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: hope, guilt, determination. It was a turning point, but it was clear that the road ahead would be long and challenging. Just as the husband began to think the worst was over, the unexpected twist he'd been bracing for came to light. A junior staff member, emboldened by the investigation's outcome, came forward with a shocking revelation. She had discovered a hidden network of financial irregularities within the hospital's accounts, large sums of money being funneled to an external entity with no clear purpose. The husband's stomach churned as he reviewed the documents she provided. The transactions were linked to a shell company, and the dates corresponded with key moments in the hospital's history. Moments when resources seemed inexplicably scarce, staff positions were cut, and patient care suffered. It became clear that the administrator hadn't acted alone. Someone higher up had been pulling the strings, using the hospital as a front for their own financial gain. Determined to get to the bottom of it, the husband enlisted the help of forensic accountants and legal experts. The investigation quickly uncovered a web of deceit that extended beyond the hospital to a network of private contractors, suppliers, and even members of the regional health board. The scale of the corruption was staggering, and it became clear that exposing it would require immense courage and resolve. In the midst of this new revelation, the husband found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of his wife, whose strength and resilience had inspired him to take on this fight. He thought of the countless patients and staff members who had suffered in silence, their voices drowned out by a culture of fear and complacency. And he thought of the future, a future where his children, and everyone else's, could receive care in a system built on integrity and compassion. The climax came during a public town hall meeting, where the husband and his team presented their findings to the community. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. As he stepped up to the podium, he felt a surge of nerves, but also a deep sense of purpose. "What we've uncovered isn't just a failure of leadership," he began, his voice steady. "It's a betrayal of the trust that binds us as a community. But today, we take the first step toward healing and accountability." He detailed the financial schemes, the collusion among officials, and the steps being taken to bring those responsible to justice. As he spoke, he could see the audience's reactions: shock, anger, and finally, a sense of resolve. When he finished, the room erupted into applause, and people began to share their own stories of resilience and hope. But just as the meeting was wrapping up, a final twist emerged. An older man in the audience stood up, his face lined with years of experience and wisdom. He introduced himself as a retired doctor who had worked at the hospital decades ago. "I've seen this kind of corruption before," he said, his voice carrying a weight of authority. "And I can tell you this, it doesn't end with arrests and firings. It ends with rebuilding trust, brick by brick, day by day. It ends with all of us committing to never let this happen again." The husband felt a lump in his throat as the man's words resonated through the room. It was a powerful reminder that the fight for justice wasn't about tearing down, but about building something better. As the crowd dispersed, he felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt confident that they were on the right path. In the weeks that followed, the hospital underwent a complete overhaul. New leadership was appointed, policies were revised, and a culture of transparency and accountability began to take root. The husband and his wife continued to play active roles in the transformation, their bond stronger than ever after weathering the storm together. And though the scars of the past remained, they served as a reminder of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. For the husband, the experience was more than a victory against corruption. It was a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the unyielding strength of a community united by a common purpose. As the weeks turned into months, the hospital slowly began to heal. The once toxic environment was now undergoing a transformation that was both structural and cultural. Staff meetings became opportunities for open dialogue, and new training programs emphasized empathy, communication, and accountability. The husband and his wife continued to be deeply involved, attending sessions and lending their voices to the movement that had blossomed from the ashes of corruption. One of the most powerful changes came from the staff themselves. Those who had once felt powerless found the courage to speak up. Nurses who had been silenced for years now had a platform to share their experiences and ideas for improvement. A staff-led council was formed to ensure that every voice, from the custodial team to the senior physicians, was heard. It was a small step, but it symbolized a larger shift in the hospital's identity. The husband and his wife often walked the halls together, observing the changes firsthand. One day, as they passed by the maternity ward, they saw a nurse patiently comforting a laboring mother. It was a stark contrast to the dismissive treatment the wife had endured months earlier. She squeezed her husband's hand and whispered, "This is what we fought for." He nodded, a sense of pride and relief washing over him. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was progress. The independent investigation into the financial irregularities wrapped up, leading to multiple arrests and resignations across the region. The hospital's former administrator faced criminal charges, along with several others who had been complicit in the schemes. While justice was served, the husband knew that legal consequences were only part of the solution. The true victory lay in rebuilding trust with the community. The public's response was heartening. Patients who had once avoided the hospital began to return, encouraged by the changes they saw. Community leaders collaborated with the hospital's new management to create outreach programs, ensuring that marginalized voices were included in shaping the future of healthcare in the area. The hospital became a symbol of resilience and hope, a testament to what could be achieved when people came together to demand better. Amid these changes, the husband and his wife found their own sense of closure. For her, the experience had been deeply personal, a reminder of her own strength and the importance of advocating for herself and others. For him, it had been a journey of discovery, learning the true meaning of leadership and the power of standing up for what was right. They often reflected on how far they had come, their bond stronger than ever after weathering the storm together. One afternoon, the couple was invited to a ceremony at the hospital, where a new wing dedicated to maternal health was being unveiled. The husband had worked tirelessly to secure funding for the project, ensuring that no mother would ever feel dismissed or unheard again. As they stood before the gathered crowd, the wife spoke from the heart, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned. Her words resonated deeply, a reminder of why the fight for change had been so important. After the ceremony, a young nurse approached them, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. Your story gave me the courage to speak up when I saw something wrong. It's people like you who remind us why we do this work." The couple exchanged a glance, humbled by the impact their journey had on others. As life returned to a new kind of normal, the couple found joy in the simple moments. They spent more time with their growing family, cherishing the laughter and love that filled their home. They also continued to advocate for systemic change, sharing their story with other hospitals and organizations. Their goal was not just to fix one institution, but to inspire a broader movement toward accountability and compassion in healthcare. One evening, as they sat together on their porch, the wife turned to her husband and smiled. "You know, if someone had told me a year ago that we'd be here." She trailed off, shaking her head in disbelief. "It's been a journey, hasn't it?" He chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "A journey I wouldn't trade for anything," he said, "because it brought us here. It showed us what we're capable of." The final twist came not from the hospital or the system they had fought against, but from the quiet realization that their story had become something bigger than themselves. It was a reminder that change often starts with a single voice, a single act of courage, and that those ripples can grow into waves that transform entire communities. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over their home, they sat in comfortable silence, content in the knowledge that they had made a difference. The fight had been difficult, and the scars would remain, but so too would the lessons and the legacy they had created. In the end, they knew that the most important battles were not won in grand gestures, but in the everyday choices to stand up for what was right and to never stop striving for a better world.